Hey everyone, so I'm back with the second half of my video where I talk 7 strategies to win your fantasy football league. So real quick before I go to the 5th point, I'm going to recap what I've talked about already. The first point was the draft is important, but you don't win at the draft. It's important to make sure that you build your team as you go through the season and make moves to the right players at the right time in order to win, not necessarily who you take in the draft. 2, you want to find guys that are going to be the focal point of your offense, guys who the stats on the offense revolves around them, and they'll contribute a good chunk of points week to week. You want to stock running backs and wide receivers on your team with most of the available bench space that you have. And then you want to make sure that you're taking guys who have potential to boom and become star players over guys who are modest veterans who you pretty much already know what you've got with them. So before I go to the 5th point, I want to give a quick example of that 4th point again, because I realize I talked about the Saints twice, and I'm going to try to give you a little more diversity with different teams. So a good example, again, of taking guys who have potential over guys who are just veterans that are going to give you modest production, Philadelphia Eagles. So the Eagles' offense for the last couple of years has been relying upon Alshon Jeffrey is their number 1 receiver, but he has a continual list of injury problems that just never seem to go away. Deshaun Jackson came back as well, but he is another older receiver who has a lot of boom or bust games, has a lot of injuries. He's generally just not very reliable in fantasy football anymore. So for the Philadelphia Eagles, Travis Fulgham, the rookie wide receiver, was a much better option for you to have as your wide receiver from that team than either Alshon Jeffrey or Deshaun Jackson. Mix the names up a little bit, but both of those guys are guys that you're not gaining anything by having them on your roster other than potentially trading them to somebody who still thinks they have value. So that's a good example of taking guys with potential. So let's go now to the 5th point. The 5th point is that you want to make sure that you check your waiver wires every day. Most importantly for waivers is, so if you're not familiar with fantasy football, you're going to play the games throughout the weekend, and then you're going to finish on Monday Night Football. And then generally, there are exceptions this year because of COVID, which delayed it. But after all the games are complete, Tuesday is when you'll put in your waiver claims, and then Wednesday morning, those will go into effect. So Tuesday is the most important day to really study your waivers and pick up the guys that are going to help you for the upcoming week. But it's also important to see who gets dropped from that waiver claim as well, because some guys will drop players that they shouldn't be dropping that you can then pick up. A good example of this is a few years ago, Zac Ertz had a bad game, and one of the fantasy owners in a league I was in dropped him, which is mind-blowing because Zac Ertz didn't have a good season last year, but he has been a pretty good player, especially at the tight end position, which is not exactly has a lot of high-producing players. So that's an example of if you weren't checking your waivers, you might not have seen that, and somebody else who would be able to swoop in and then get a starting tight end for the rest of the season. So keep that in mind. You always want to make sure you're paying attention to the waivers and what the other teams around you are doing. And there are some tricks on the waiver wire as well that I like to do. I'm going to get into that in another video, but there's some tricks I do that can help you in terms of making sure you're protecting players from being claimed. So I'll talk about that in another video. My 6th point is you want to constantly evaluate your roster stock for trades. So kind of like I talked about in the first video, the goal is to flip the players that you have on your bench for and some mid-level starters for elite starters, if you can do that. It's very difficult to pull it off, but there are times when you've been able to do it. Or there are times where you could be able to do it. So a good example, in 2018, after the first week of the season, Kareem Hunt had a very bad first game with Patrick Mahomes after his first start with the Chiefs. So a lot of people were panicking and thinking that the Chiefs are not going to be a run-heavy offense, which is ironic because that's what's happened to them now. They don't really rely too much on the running backs. But at the time when they had Kareem Hunt, elite level running back, so I knew that he was going to get involved at some point again in the season. But what I did was I took Demaryius Thomas. I think it was like a middle level receiver as well. I can't remember his name exactly. and then Adrian Peterson. But so it was Demaryius Thomas, receiver, Adrian Peterson, 3 players for Kareem Hunt, who at the time was a late first-round draft pick running back, and the guy accepted the trade because he bought into the hype of Adrian Peterson. Like I was saying, a guy who's had a great career, but he's past his prime. Same with Demaryius Thomas. And that other player, can't remember his name, but obviously if I can't remember his name, he's not a big name. He just had a good game for that one game. And that's exactly what you want to try to do in fantasy football. Get your middle players, trade them for a better player. Kind of like the NBA almost. You want to try to build super teams, if that's a good analogy for you, I guess. So I always try to make a trade a week. I think it's just fun to do. It's not necessarily that they'll take the trade, but you want to always look for ways to improve your roster. You can't ever be content with what you have, because once you become content, that's when you get complacent, that's when you're not paying attention to the matchups, and then somebody can upset you. So always evaluate your roster for trades. And then my last strategy, number 7, is build the depth for your team and get second opinions for your matchups of who you're going to play for the game. So I like to do this going into the weekend once I've already kind of got my roster set. I spend Saturday, a little bit of Saturday, some Sunday morning as well, kind of just getting second opinions from other people when I have guys that you can choose between. And the whole point is that you want to set yourself in a position to make these choices, because you want to have multiple running backs, multiple receivers like I was talking about, that you can choose between. And if you're in a position where you don't have like a Travis Kelce or a George Kittle or a Darren Waller at tight end, you can stream a tight end. You can drop the one you have for that game, pick up one on waivers, constantly do that roulette. I do that with kickers a lot as well. Defenses too, depending on the defense you have. So, and there's nothing wrong with reaching out for advice. The ones that I really like fantasy footballers. I think they do one of the best jobs I've seen of breaking down particular players and roster construction. The only thing with them is that they have hour videos a day, so you really have to commit a lot of time to watching them. But they're hilarious. I really enjoy watching them. They have like really good chemistry together. Show's always very entertaining, but it's time consuming. So that's the only real complaint I have about them. Another source that I think is really good, especially if you only got a few minutes, CBS Sports. Jamie Eisenberg is a very good fantasy analyst. He gives you a great breakdown of guys that you should pick up for that week, guys that you should consider dropping, guys that you should start for that given week given the matchups. There's also a tool if you just Google fantasy matchups, or if you just Google like for example like Julian Edelman or Cooper Kupp or something like that, and then they'll tell you, they'll give a percent of people and they'll give you the names of the columnists. So if I see somebody like Jamie Eisenberg or the fantasy footballers like Mike Wright, Jason Moore, Andy Holloway, if I see their general projections of who's going where, I'll kind of maybe use that in my opinion as well. But there's been times where I've actually picked the other player than what all 4 of them have taken, and then it actually worked out well for me. So go with your gut in terms of who to start for the matchups, and I'll help you with that in terms of which player that you should play. But it doesn't hurt to get second opinions, and that'll help set you up for success. And if you do those 7 things, and if you repeat steps 5 through 7 from this video weekly, it'll set you up in a position to be successful and win your fantasy football league. So I'm going to make more videos about this as the season goes along, as the off season goes along, analyze players that are going to be good assets for you to have. But yeah, let me know what you think about this kind of stuff. I'm excited to start doing this. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.